Hello, everybody, to our first meeting this year of the Foreign Press Association with a press conference with Ambassador John Bolton, who has returned after his last scintillating performance and is here in the middle of the old Chinese curse, allegedly said that may you live in interesting times, and few times could have been more interesting in the last few weeks for Ambassador Bolton or the rest of us. I think I've never known. I think it must have been like the Cuban Missile Crisis before ordinary people were so worried about what was going on. Mostly because they don't seem to. Nobody knew what was going to happen in the course of last week, and people's imaginations ran away with them. But there was a lot of fairly unimaginable things going on, and one of the issues, of course, is we have possibly. We have a lame duck president that showed signs of turning into a vulture at the end. Still shows signs. We still don't know. I mean, I find it difficult. It's easy to misunderestimate this president in his capricious ways. But one of the people who has sort of had a fair assessment of his capricious ways has been Ambassador John Bolton. Now, you've been in the Republican Party for many years. You've been in the inner circles of the cabinet. You're watching what's happening now. I mean, is there a graceful exit strategy for Donald Trump that's good for him and, well, good for the country? That's at all feasible. I understand you have reservations about attempts impeachment and Article 25, but can we leave him in there?
Well, I think that what he should do is resign. I mean, that would be the appropriate thing to do and the gracious thing to do, but I think the chances of him resigning are somewhere less than zero. So at this point, we have 8 days left until the inauguration. And I think when people propose invoking the 25th Amendment or propose beginning the impeachment process, they have a responsibility to make the case on a cost-benefit analysis that the country is left better off by going through one or the other or both of these procedures than simply by gritting our teeth, getting him out of the White House, and then letting normal law enforcement and other mechanisms, congressional hearings and the like, deal with whatever his role was or whatever the appropriate response is. And I just don't think, and it has nothing to do with defending Donald Trump. This is a cold-blooded cost-benefit analysis looking at the real question, what's best for the country while maintaining fidelity to the Constitution. I don't think you can make the case that using the 25th Amendment, which this situation is simply not intended for, or impeachment really are very helpful.
Well, it would be gesture politics, I presume you're saying. It would make
well, I think you put your
feel good.
Yeah, no, I think you put your finger on it. It is gesture politics, and that's exactly what I think is wrong with it. In the international arena, I have written at length about the International Criminal Court, universal jurisdiction, efforts to prosecute people accused of war crimes, crimes against humanity, gross abuses of human rights. And what has struck me in research over many years on this subject is how many countries faced with horrible abuses of human rights, much worse than what has happened here, have not chosen to invoke law enforcement. They've chosen something else. I think what we see now on Capitol Hill is what I have called the prosecution uber alles approach. Whereas by contrast, just as an example, and it's not a perfect analogy, I acknowledge that, but in South Africa, after decades of apartheid, the perpetrators of apartheid could have been prosecuted under their own laws, thousands of people for hundreds of thousands of illegal actions. But Nelson Mandela and others decided that what was more important for South Africa was to bring the country together. So they created what they called a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. In other words, Nelson Mandela rejected prosecution of the apartheid regime people, looking for something else. Abraham Lincoln might have called that with malice toward none and charity toward all. Those feelings not in evidence in Washington these days.
Well, that's one of the problems, of course, is that Nelson Mandela, in dealing with the old South African apartheid regime, was dealing with people who had accepted, who were prepared to make a deal, who saw that the game was up, and were very happy to accommodate. One of the problems with the people who stormed Capitol Hill is that they don't look very reconcilable, and
I don't think everybody in South Africa, all the proponents of apartheid, were reconciled till it's over. They lost. That's what happened, and so they had a choice. They could continue resisting, or they could follow the truth and reconciliation path. All I'm saying is that the highest goal here should not be what's the most damage we can do to Donald Trump. The highest goal here is what's best for the United States. Now, up on the Hill, Madame Defarge has made it clear that the tumbrils are going to roll, and I suppose tomorrow they will vote for impeachment. But I think it's they have not made the cost-benefit case, and maybe it can be made, but I haven't heard it yet.
Well, as a long-standing supporter, stalwart in the Republican Party, what's the Republican Party going to look like after this? Because you have a lot of these rank-and-file supporters are basically waving the guillotine and the tumbrils for its own leadership. I mean, that gallows that was erected outside the Capitol was for the Republican Vice President of the United States, not for Nancy Pelosi, as I recall. So,
yeah. Well, look, I have a boringly consistent view on these kinds of events, no matter who perpetrates them. I think anybody involved who violated the law should be prosecuted to the fullest extent possible, and then sentenced to the maximum allowable without penalty of parole.
Without parole? That's I'm a bleeding heart liberal. I always accept that redeeming sinners is possible.
Maybe it is, but I'd put them in the slammer and throw away the key. It's unacceptable. As I say, it doesn't matter who does it. It is unacceptable.
But well, you're coming from a point of principle, which a tremendous number of elected politicians here find unacceptable, since they're always looking for the expedient way, and will they get elected, and will these people support us in the next primary?
Well, I think there's got to be a serious conversation within the Republican Party. I think that, in fact, has already started, and I expect it to go on to try and correct the damage that Trump has done. And I do think he's done damage. He's done damage to the country. He's done damage to the party, which is one reason why, for the first time in my life, I didn't vote for the Republican nominee for president, because I thought, while we could easily recover from one Trump term, I wasn't sure whether we could recover from two Trump terms. It would be a lot easier if he just returned to Mar-a-Lago and stayed there. I don't know what he thinks he's going to do. I don't think he yet fully appreciates the consequences of the last, not just what happened tragically on January the 6th, but the last 2 months of encouraging what my longtime friend and lawyer Chuck Cooper called a congressional coup, which some of them were trying on the 6th of January. But I think the damage to Trump is very real. And I think that once he leaves office at noon on the 20th of January, it will become increasingly apparent that he's yesterday's news, and his influence will drop dramatically.
Oh, one of the issues is, of course, he's the president of the United States, and the damage to the United States is clear. But there's also the question of foreign policy, of U.S. standing, of the whole network of alliances, respect. The so-called balance of power is dangerously unbalanced at the moment. We saw over the last few months people taking advantage of the sort of interregnum, whether it's the Western Sahara, Azerbaijan and Armenia, whether it's across the world, people in the Tammany Hall doctrine, they've seen their opportunities and took them. And can that be walked back under a new administration?
Well, it depends on which particular issue we're talking about. I mean, Western Sahara happens to be something that I've worked on since
I know.
George H.W. Bush administration, when we created MINURSO, UN peacekeeping force that was designed to have a referendum on the status of Western Sahara. And I think the give back that the administration engaged in to recognize incorrectly, obviously, Moroccan sovereignty over Western Sahara was the result of a bunch of dilettantes giving away something that wasn't theirs to give away. I think this is one clear example where the Biden administration should say, we're reversing what the Trump administration said. They should not open a consulate in the territory of the Western Sahara that recognizes Moroccan sovereignty. And frankly, they should reverse years of conversation in the United Nations about autonomy for Western Sahara and hold a referendum. That's what we said in 1991. How hard is it to figure out?
Well, the clue is the UN mission there is to supervise the referendum.
Yeah, I mean, I would end MINURSO, frankly, if there's not going to be a referendum. That's what we instituted it for. I helped write the resolution. I mean, I had some background in this, and I think it was the decision on Moroccan sovereignty was given with essentially no thought at all, and it was a big mistake. Big mistake for the credibility of the United States. When we make a commitment, we should stick by it.
Well, that moving, and another area that's been of concern to you has been the South China Sea and the issues of what's happening there. Now, I'm sure the administration in its last few weeks and months took some steps, for example, on Taiwan, which I suspect you probably agree with, but they sort of left it, they've left a hot poker in the hands of the Biden administration. And we have the issue of Hong Kong, where the Chinese, once again, taking advantage of the inattention in Washington, stamped down in Hong Kong on democracy and free press. So to what extent can an incoming administration reconcile support for principles of freedom, democracy, etc., and the expressed support for Taiwan, and yet actually talk rationally to the Chinese about issues without being demonstratively provocative, as Donald Trump often was?
Well, look, I said over 20 years ago, I thought the United States should extend full diplomatic recognition to Taiwan. It is anomalous that the United States ever imposed restrictions on what its diplomats or officials did in connection with meeting with officials from Taiwan. This is something that goes back to Jimmy Carter in 1979 when he suspended recognition of Taiwan and recognized the PRC. And because of tender sensitivities in Beijing, he said, for example, U.S. diplomats could not meet with Taiwanese authorities in the State Department. So in my various incarnations, I've had to go across the street from the State Department to have coffee with them in one of the dismal coffee shops near the State Department, or I've had breakfast with Taiwanese officials in New York at different places. It's ridiculous. It's inconvenient for the United States. Nobody gets to tell us who we meet with or where our officials travel. So that's the sort of thing. It was humiliation for the United States ever to impose these restrictions on itself, and long overdue to remove them.
Well, the other issue, of course, which is close to your heart, is President-elect Biden is walking back on the withdrawal from the Jcpoa. It's so this is from many people's point of view, the Europeans are welcoming it. I gather you don't.
No, of course not. The Jcpoa was a terrible deal in 2015. It hasn't gotten any better with age. The Iranian regime has shown no strategic decision whatever actually to give up nuclear weapons. They will remain a threat not only as a would-be nuclear power, but as a state sponsor of terrorism. as a troublemaker in the Middle East as long as that regime is in power. And while I think getting out of the deal in 2018 was exactly the right thing to do, it was the first thing I worked on when I joined the administration as National Security Advisor. And I'm proud to say that 30 days after I arrived, we withdrew, despite 15 months of being unable to withdraw at the beginning of the administration. That we didn't go far enough, and that our policy should have been regime change, because that's the only thing that will remove this threat in the region and globally, and allow the people of Iran to have a real choice what kind of government they want.
But I think you have a sort of reputation as a pragmatist on looking at these things. Wanting regime change is one thing. Dislike of the Ayatollah's regime is quite understandable. But what feasible means are there to affect or support this without risking a major conflagration in the region that would kill millions?
Well, I don't think there's any risk of that kind of conflagration unless the Iranians start it themselves. And I think the fact that you have seen in the past several months, Bahrain, the United Arab Emirates, in addition to Morocco, and I think others will come into play as well, recognize Israel because they share a common enemy, and that's the regime in Tehran. I think the regime is shakier now than it's ever been. I don't really think it's a theocracy anymore. I think it's a military dictatorship. And I think the objective should be to find ways to help the people of Iran, who are more disenchanted with it than I think they've ever been since 1979, to try and split the IRGC and the military, and convince them that continuing down this road is only going to lead to continued isolation and deprivation of the people. Just too bad the Europeans don't see it the same way.
Well, talking about how the Europeans and others see it, I mean, can you explain from first principles why it is that you think that that Saudi Arabia, a theocracy that minces journalists, puts them through the grinder literally, should be more deserving of support than Iran?
What I care about more than anything else is the safety of the United States. Saudi Arabia does not have, and to the best of our knowledge, is not pursuing nuclear weapons.
That's one small advantage, I suppose. Yes, but so it's the nuclear issue is the major one,
and that's right, and the support for international terrorism. The regime in Tehran is the biggest threat to international peace and security in the Middle East. And as long as that regime remains in power, it will continue that way.
But obviously the Europeans see this differently.
Not surprisingly.
Well, if we dismiss the Europeans in this way. But I mean, looking
Biden's going to have to look. He's got important American allies who see the Iranian threat pretty much the way I've just described it. This is not a case, although there's a lot of glib talk about cooperating better with the allies. The question is going to be whether Biden wants to cooperate better with the Europeans here or with the GCC, Arab states, and Israel. So it's a lot more complicated politically and diplomatically for Biden than it was for Obama in 2015.
And do you see, is there sort of a Gordian knot that can be cut?
Yeah, the regime in Tehran can be overthrown.
How?
Because the people, as I described before, I think have less support for it than we've ever seen before. The Western press doesn't cover it, but there have been examples of riots, civil disobedience all over the country, not just in Tehran where the Western journalists sit, but out in the rest of the country. I think the trouble, of course, is that the IRGC still has the weapons. But I don't think the IRGC is a block of granite. I think there are fissures in it that could be exploited. And I think that's what the people of Iran would like to see happen. And I think it should be U.S. policy to see the regime overthrown. That doesn't mean military force, but it does mean helping the people of Iran for them to accomplish it themselves.
We're talking about the issue of U.S. interests versus, sort of support for principles. In the case of China, the Trump administration has been studiedly silent about for example, the persecution of the Uyghurs in China, in the old Xinjiang. Is there a pragmatic way that the US could support them in principle without kowtowing to the Chinese?
Well, I think the Trump administration policy on China was just as erratic as its policy on most things. For the first 3 years of the administration, Trump's main focus was on a trade deal with China, what he called the deal of the century, the biggest deal in history, because all Trump deals are the biggest deal in history. He rejected the statements on the anniversary of Tiananmen Square in 2019. He told us to back away from imposing sanctions on China under American law because of their persecution of the Uyghurs. He didn't want to talk about the gross violation of the handover agreement between China and Great Britain with the suppression of the one country, two systems, substantial degree of autonomy model for Hong Kong. And he persisted in that right up until 2020, when the coronavirus pandemic took hold and people realized that it had originated in China, that China had lied about it, had covered up the extent of the disease and its nature for a long time, had engaged in disinformation campaigns against the United States. And as he could tell from public opinion surveys in the United States and all across Western Europe and most of the rest of the world, public opinion on China was turning very negative. So then Trump became negative on China himself. This is just absolute classic Trump behavior, because it reflected him pursuing public opinion. And I think, I don't know what Biden's policy is going to be. I think the default position is that it will look a lot like the Obama administration, which I think would be much too benign with respect to China. But I think the same thing could have happened had there been a second Trump term. If Xi Jinping had called him and said, hey, congratulations on the election, let's talk about trade, Trump could have done a 180 very easily. This would not have caused him any trouble at all, which is why I think those who say that we were pursuing a hard line on China, which now may change, I think misunderstand what Trump was up to. He was pursuing what he felt was a line beneficial to his own political interest, which is pretty much a capsule description of his 4 years in office.
And one of the big enemy for much of the post-war era has been in Moscow with Putin. And this is, as we know, there've been loads of questions, not always necessarily rational, about the degree of Russian involvement in the elections, and what the American approach to Russia should be, whether it's containment, confrontation, engagement, dismissal. So do you have a roadmap you would suggest to President Biden about his relations with Putin?
Yeah. Well, look, I said before I joined the Trump administration that the Russian efforts to disrupt our 2016 election amounted to an act of war against the Constitution, and I've never changed my mind on that. That is a different question from whether Trump or the Trump campaign colluded with Russia to help get Trump elected. I really don't think the campaign was smart enough to be able to figure out how to do it, even if they wanted to do it. And I think those who argue that collusion took place have the same burden that Donald Trump does when he argues the 2020 election was stolen. You have to present evidence. Suspicion is not good enough. And I don't think there is evidence of collusion. I think there's evidence that Trump, acting in the same way he acts in similar circumstances, never wants to admit he's done anything wrong, never wants to admit he's made a mistake, never wants to admit a claim made by an opponent, never wants to give any edge at all to any claim made against him. And he saw claims of Russia collusion, or I beg your pardon, he saw claims of Russian interference in the election as tantamount to claims of Russian collusion. And he wouldn't admit it. He just wouldn't give the opposition the benefit of the doubt. And I argued to him, as did others on several occasions, look, if you acknowledge Russian efforts to influence the election and distinguish that from collusion, you're strengthening your case. but he wouldn't accept it. So, I think it's pretty easy for Biden to have a straighter line of thought to what the policy should be. But I remember the Cold War very well. It was very hard to get Democrats to take a hard line toward what was then the Soviet Union. So if in the last 4 years, their DNA when it comes to Moscow has changed, then I'll welcome the change.
So what it is a major existential issue, as you have in Russia a sort of an economic basket case that's a military superpower because of the history. It has a it's like a sort of scorpion. Its offensive capability is far greater than the body that supports it in many ways. So is there a rational way to contain? I mean, there's a continuous encroachment on the fringes with Azerbaijan, Armenia, Georgia, Ukraine. What can a US administration do without provoking the scorpion's tail to strike?
Well, I think Putin has played a weak hand very well, and I think the irony is that even as the Biden transition team is talking about how tough they're going to be on Russia, they're prepared to extend the New START treaty for some unspecified period of time, perhaps up to the full 5 years the treaty allows, which I think would be a catastrophic mistake. It would be a gift to Putin. So it's very hard to predict what Biden will do, but I think that first, if he stumbles out of the block by making concessions on the New START treaty, I think it's going to be very hard for him to recover.
Yeah, and there are other issues which we have. Britain and the European Union. Donald Trump was renowned for supporting Britain leaving the European Union, and cheered. And what's Biden's attitude going to be? Is he going to extend the life raft that Britain will probably need as a result of Brexit, or is he going to be pragmatic and say, "Hey, you jumped, you swim"?
Look, I don't think Britain needs a life raft. I think it's the EU that needs the life raft. Independence, that's measured by bean counters, doesn't reflect what I think the British really wanted, which was a return to sovereignty from Brussels to London, and they got it. I'm exuberant about the possibility for Britain moving forward. I think that Trump talked about a quick free trade deal with the UK, but he never did much about it. So like much of the Trump administration, a lot of rhetoric and not much performance. I think Biden may have wished that Britain stayed in the EU, but they've got an agreement now. It's over. And I think, if you calculate what's in America's interest here, it still is a quick free trade agreement with the UK. So that's something I would think the trade negotiators of both countries should focus on. They should have focused on it long ago, but they should certainly begin again very, very energetically on the 20th of January.
I'm looking at the questions as are coming in from people here on the side. So still staying in Europe, what about the Balkans, which is the sort of one of the remaining tripwire points between the West and Moscow? Do you think that the deal, for example, the Kosovo-Serbia deal that was run through, presumably to get Kosovo recognition of Israel, does it have teeth? Can it hold, or will it be unwound as fast as possible?
Well, I think the Serbia-Kosovo deal was a fairly minimal event. I mean, I think there was a chance some years ago, and certainly it was something that former British Prime Minister Tony Blair was very much interested in pursuing, that with some territorial rectification, there might have been mutual recognition between Serbia and Kosovo, and an element of instability that remains from the former Yugoslavia could have been overcome. I don't see that happening in a Biden administration, but Biden was very fortunate in the 2020 campaign. He sat in his basement in Wilmington, didn't say very much. The Democrats wanted a referendum on the Trump presidency. And they got it because Trump also wanted a referendum on the Trump presidency, and perfectly understandable. It allowed him to talk about himself again, which is what he likes to do. So Biden is now in a position where, certainly in the national security space, he's had to make minimal public pronouncements during the campaign period. which gives him flexibility. Now, I do think, given his appointments to key national security positions, the standard should be, the default position should be assumed to be the Obama administration policy. If it's going to differ, we'll see in the next few months.
There's one just come in from a German correspondent, Eva Schweitzer. She's asking about Angela Merkel's refugee policy. Was that in the interests of the US? And if not, why was it not communicated? And I'd like to broaden that out. What is your assessment of the role of Angela Merkel since she's about to leave the scene?
I noticed just this morning that she's criticized Twitter for pulling down Trump's account, which is probably the nicest thing she said about Trump in 4 years. We'll now see whether, and I would say surprisingly, we'll now see whether Trump's able to say a kind word about her as he departs office. Look, I think the decision to allow hundreds of thousands of refugees from the Middle East into Europe unscreened is a problem for Europe. I remember at the time, a member of the Lebanese cabinet estimated that a very substantial number of these people were going to be terrorists, and those that were have been lost track of. But that's a European problem, not an American problem, except indirectly when they come to the United States.
We have also, speaking of departing people, Antonio Guterres has announced that he is running for a second term, although, I haven't seen much in the way of running so far of any kind from the Secretary General. Do you have any views on whether he's a worthy candidate or whether he should follow Trump and give up?
Well, I haven't heard of any other candidates, so I'll just withhold judgment until we see if this is a horse race or if people are so uninterested in being Secretary General that they just let him have another term out of disinterest.
Out of disinterest, that's a nice one. Returning to the Republican Party, we have a question from James Reinl. A lot of big companies, as a result, especially as a result of last week and the cumulative effect of the Trump exit, are pulling their money from the Republicans. Even Sheldon Adelson seems to have had second thoughts.
Well, he's died. That's one way to have a second thought.
Yes, it is. Yes, he did. I missed that. Sorry. Oh well. So how is that going to affect the Republican Party going forward?
Well, I think there may be less here than meets the eye. First, most of the statements I've seen, and I won't say that I've seen them all, but the ones I have seen from these companies said they were going to pause their contributions, which implies, if not explicitly, that they will resume them at some point. And we just have had an election a little bit over 2 months ago, so this is not necessarily a time when companies are making large amounts of political contributions. So I think it's an expression of their distaste for the Trump effort to overturn the results of the election. I think that's entirely understandable. Whether it will have much of an effect, I think too soon to tell.
But that really takes us back to where we started about the future of the Republican Party. If you have a disgruntled, inflamed mass base that feels it's been cheated and the election was stolen from them, and a Republican Party establishment that's trying to be more pragmatic and let's say slightly more attuned to reality, can this coalition actually work as a functioning party, or is it going to split or fall apart in ruins?
Well, I don't buy the argument that the base is pro-Trump and the establishment's not. The bulk of the people who voted for Trump would have voted for any Republican nominee. I think that's clear. Just as the bulk of the people who voted for Joe Biden would have voted for any Democratic nominee. Biden got more votes than any other American candidate in history, and Trump got the second highest number of votes. It's not because of their unique qualities. It's because we had a much higher turnout compared to recent elections. And I think it's a mistake as well to think that the quote unquote Trump base is a block of granite. Public opinion is subject to change when it meets up with political leadership. And I think that's part of the obligation that we have within the Republican Party going forward as part of this conversation to correct the deception that Trump has practiced. I mean, when you think about it, he really conned his own supporters into believing this notion that the election had been stolen. I've said, he's failed every place that he's tried to contest the election, and yet continues to espouse these conspiracy theories, which means that this, in Trump's own view, must be that this conspiracy is so vast and so successful that it left no evidence behind. And if that's the case, I think we definitely have to find the people who perpetrated and get them into the CIA as quickly as we can.
Indeed. But the worry from a lot of commentators is that Trump, insofar as he had a rational purpose for his actions, was to set himself up as a sort of the leader of the opposition. That, on one of the things the US politics is missing is this idea of the leader of the opposition, in that the failed candidate can continue to stay in politics and to fight a corner. Failed presidential candidates usually disappear without trace in American politics, comparatively speaking, compared with, say, Britain or other European countries. There was an argument that Trump was actually trying to set himself up, if he ever accepted that Biden was going to take office, as the leader of the opposition, so he would be wielding the Republican Party against it. So he would still manage to control it even in opposition, which would be a departure from American politics. Is that still feasible?
It's not going to happen, and it wasn't going to happen even if we hadn't had the tragedy of January the 6th. When Trump leaves at noon on the 20th of January, this is an existential change. He will go from sitting in the Oval Office, the most powerful office in the world, to sitting by the pool at Mar-a-Lago. And you cannot underestimate the extent of the change. The focus of the nation inevitably will be drawn to the new Biden administration, and Trump will become yesterday's news. It's not to say he will have no influence, but it will be declining over time. And what he did through his inexcusable conduct in the 2 months after the election, and particularly on January the 6th, I think is simply accelerating at an ever more rapid speed the decline in his influence.
Will the Biden administration be able to stand up to China and Russia, or will it be sort of too accommodating? And the other issues I'm thinking of, nobody sort of reconciled with Erdogan. Which side was Erdogan on? Was he a side? Was he on his own side? How do you deal with a sort of medium power like Turkey in the region?
Well, as I said, I don't think we know an awful lot about the specifics of what Biden's going to want to do. He's made it clear he wants to focus first on coronavirus here and other domestic issues. The Obama administration, again, the likely default position, I thought was feckless and incompetent for its 8 years in office. And I'm not looking forward to 4 more years of it under Biden. We'll have to see. Now, I mean, this is where the possibility of continued efforts to impeach Donald Trump could really fairly dramatically undercut Biden's efforts to get started under whatever system they may try and work out here. Instead of the opening of the Biden administration, we're going to spend the next 8 days talking about the 25th Amendment or impeachment, and then if they make the mistake of continuing to try and pursue the impeachment process, which I think lapses when Trump's term ends. That's obviously not the Democratic view, but I think it's incorrect. You could have another 6 months of people talking about Trump more than they talk about Biden. It's just inconceivable to me why Biden would think that's a good idea.
Insofar as the impeachment has a practical purpose, according to some of its proponents, it's to prevent Trump standing for office again. Is that feasible? Is Trump going to be a viable candidate in 4 years' time?
Well, I don't think he is going to be a viable candidate, but they're obviously not going to have a trial and verdict in the Senate before the 20th of January. And I think the language and the structure of the Constitution is very clear that that impeachment does not extend once a president is out of office. I mean, it's if you look at Section 4 of Article 2, which I will just quote very briefly, you know, Mark Twain used to say, everybody complains about the weather, but nobody does anything about it. In Washington, everybody talks about the Constitution and nobody reads it. So I will just read briefly what Article 2, Section 4 says. And I'll leave out a few words, but it won't change the meaning. This is Section 4, Article 2. The president shall be removed from office on impeachment for and conviction of treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. Shall be removed from office. Now, if he's not in office, he obviously can't be removed from office, which means that clause of the Constitution, under the Democrats' theory, has no meaning, which is not a good thing for clauses of the Constitution. It also says that in Article 1, Section 3, that judgment in cases of impeachment shall not extend further than to removal from office and disqualification to hold and enjoy any office of honor, trust, and profit under the United States. The key word there is and. It's not or. It doesn't say you can remove from office or you can disqualify. It says if you impeach and convict, you must remove and you may disqualify. So if you can't remove, you don't get to disqualification. Disqualification is not automatic anyway. Judge Alcee Hastings was impeached and convicted in the mid-1980s. I was at the Justice Department at the time, impeached and convicted by the Senate with a bipartisan majority for corruption. And the Senate did not impose disqualification on him. It simply removed him from office. Alcee Hastings is now a sitting Democratic congressman, having been elected continuously from Florida since then. So this is an area where, again, people talk a lot about the Constitution, they just don't bother to read it. That's the same problem while we're on the subject with the 25th Amendment, which is people are saying the vice president and a majority of the cabinet should remove Donald Trump because they're afraid of what he's going to do. That's not what the 25th Amendment says. It says that this provision, which has never been invoked, Section 4, has never been invoked, says the president can be declared unable to discharge the powers and duties of his office by the VP and a majority of the, not of the cabinet, that's another misconception, but by a majority of the principal officers of the executive departments. It's never been used before because nobody really understands how it works, since the president can then say, I am so able to discharge the powers and duties of my office. And if the vice president still disagrees, Congress gets, listen to this, 21 days to decide. You know, so we've got 8 days left until the term ends. Invoking the 25th Amendment would be a big mistake. I'll just say one final point on that. The Democrats need to be very careful about what they say about the 25th Amendment. Very careful. Because as we speak, and the Democrats know this, the ghost of Edith Wilson looms over this city. So I'll just say again, I think they need to be very careful what they say.
There's, I've just seen reports come in that Trump announced his refusal from the steps of Marine One, that he's not going to resign, and he's calling impeachment a witch hunt, but wants no violence. But he's heading to the Mexico border wall. So the question, you know, slightly quirky, is he going to do a runner across the border to escape all of the prosecutions that are coming the traditional way?
No, that's for well or ill, that's certainly not true. But this is an example. He's just going to say, see, they're at it again, and it goes to an argument, if we can just divorce it from Trump for a minute, about the prosecution uber alles. People say, but how do you hold these people accountable? In the international arena, it's more often called eliminating impunity. But the point, I think, is the same. And I don't doubt that Trump has committed impeachable offenses. I don't have any doubt about it at all. I don't have any doubt that he's unfit for office. The question is, do you want to invoke this enormous constitutional process with 8 days left? It's entirely possible that in the course of his conduct here, he's committed criminal offenses for which he will be prosecutable once he leaves the White House. I come back to the point I made a moment ago, not in defense of Donald Trump, in defense of the Constitution and order and stability in the United States. What is the cost-benefit argument that says it's more important to damage Trump just because we hate him so much than to try and restore order and stability in the United States? And we just saw one example yesterday. Senator Manchin of West Virginia, Democrat, said he was not persuaded by the impeachment argument. So it could be that even if Madame Defarge gets her impeachment in the House, could go to the Senate again and be defeated, or certainly not get the 2/3 majority, the supermajority, which the Constitution requires, and which would mean every Democrat and 17 Republicans, if all senators voted, would have to vote for it. If Senator Manchin isn't going to vote for it, then you need 18 Republicans. So this could be an exercise of feel-good politics, but it won't be feel-good for the Constitution, I think.
My point about the defecting across the border war was the other line that's being pursued by a lot of people, is that one of the reasons that the president wanted to stay in office for so long was it protected him from prosecution. And all across the country, ambitious, often Democratic attorneys, attorney generals, and prosecutors have been sharpening, greasing the wheels of their tumbrils to get him up in the dock. Is this feasible? Is this a likely outcome of prosecution unless he pardons himself in the last week?
Well, look, it's prosecutors pursuing legitimate criminal investigations, I think, should be encouraged to do it. It is a friend of mine, Elliot Abrams, once said, talking about U.S. attorneys, he said, they get up every morning, they look in the mirror while they're shaving, and they say, the biggest decision they face is, when I'm finished with this job, do I run for the governorship of my state or the Senate? And prosecutors have long made political careers that way, but they have an ethical obligation to bring charges only if they can meet the high standard of proving guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. Maybe some of them will, and maybe Trump will have to face that. And I think I can't obviously judge the merits of any of that. I have no idea what his private business circumstances are, but I think if you go back to Wednesday, January the 6th, there are a lot of questions that are going to be asked about what the effect of his speech was, what he intended. We haven't seen any evidence, at least I'm not aware of any connection between Trump's advisors and the mob. But if there is, that would be very serious. So I think there's a possibility here for a lot of investigations. I might say, under the process that the House has begun on impeachment, there isn't going to be any investigation in the House. So we're not going to find any new facts there, and it allows Trump to argue once again he's being persecuted.
Here's a real curveball just come in from a French journalist, Sandra Muller. If Joe Biden Joe Biden says he's prepared to work with Republicans, and he's pressing for a bipartisan approach to issues. He wants to heal the divides. Would you accept a position if he offered you one in his cabinet or as an official?
Look, I've known Joe Biden for 35 years. When we basically first met in the Judiciary Committee, when I was trying to get Ronald Reagan's judicial nominees and Supreme Court appointments confirmed to sit on the bench. And I've had many dealings with him over the years. I respect his integrity, and I have no doubt he's trying to do what he thinks is best for the country. That said, I disagree with him on the vast majority of foreign policy matters. If he were to call me, I would certainly consider seriously anything he asked me to do. I have zero expectation I'm going to get that call.
Okay, so it's a safe answer then. Where are we? One is that's a rather general one. How secure is US democracy? I mean, a lot of the world is looking and was really shaken by the events on the Capitol Hill. Although there are plenty of precedents if you look at through clear glasses at American history. I mean,
Yeah, look,
shaken confidence.
yeah, I mean, everybody in America was disturbed by what they saw, but you know, in I think it was 1954, Puerto Rican independence advocates shot up the House of Representatives. I think 5 or 6 House members were wounded, some seriously. We haven't seen this before, but this is not the mark of an organized revolution. This is not a serious threat to American democracy. I think what happened on Wednesday was utterly inexcusable, but both by what Trump said and by what the mob did. But I think as we see now, as more film comes out and we learn more about what happened in the hours and days before the mob attacked the Capitol building, there was a catastrophic security failure in decision making here. We don't know exactly where to assign responsibility, but if you look at the films which are now out at how the mob even got close to the Capitol, they went over a chain link fence. There were only the slightest barriers there. The Capitol Police were vastly outmanned. They were overwhelmed. It's a miracle that more tragedy didn't occur. And I think a great credit to the Capitol Police that they were as successful as they were in protecting the members of Congress from this mob. So there needs to be a substantial rethinking of what happened in security terms. The chief of the Capitol Police has resigned. The 2 sergeant-in-arms of the House and the Senate have resigned. The only question I'd ask is, now that we've fired the subordinates, isn't Congress in charge of its own protection? Doesn't the congressional leadership have some obligation here to explain what their decisions were in this matter? Or are they just going to say, gee, I don't know anything about it? I think this could have been prevented with adequate preparation. And then I think we would have had an angry mob, but we wouldn't have seen the disgraceful pictures of the Capitol being desecrated, which is not a word to use lightly, but that's what I think happened. That said, I just don't think this is a serious threat. I think the main threat is Trump, and he leaves office in 8 days.
It reminded me of the classic pictures of the Goths walking through the Forum in Rome at the time, in terms of its visual effect. But we're coming back towards the end, and it's Francesco Semprini's. Trump's social media bans are raising new questions on tech regulation. And I think it comes in with Angela Merkel, because I actually expressed the same opinions as she did. I think that it was a good thing that Trump was taken away from Twitter for his own good. But at the same time, who makes those decisions? This wasn't a judicial body, a sort of a judge of a group of his peers. It was a private company made this decision for its own commercial reasons, which is why I shared the concerns, unlike many people who will say, no, it shut up Trump, so it must be good. I think shutting people up is not a good idea. It sets a bad precedent.
Well, I don't have unlimited access to the forums of any of the media whose representatives are engaged in this event, and that's because they're publishers. I mean, the social media are now under attack for possible violations of the antitrust laws. And I think it's entirely possible that this so-called Section 230 of the Communications Act, which shields them from liability, is a major cause of that. People often think monopolies or monopolization takes place because of market failure. I think history would actually show that monopoly power is most often accumulated by a private company because of government policy. And here's a government policy that shielded the social media and perhaps allowed them to grow the way it did. I agree 230 should be repealed because they can't have it both ways. They're either a forum, in which case they let anybody come on and say anything they want, objectionable though it may be, or they're not. and they censor it. Once they censor it, they're acknowledging that they can take control of it and they're responsible for it. Pick one or the other. You don't get it both ways. And I think repealing 230 would do that. And I think the sooner we do it, the better.
And then final, as an envoi, we're coming to the end of what sanctions, if any, should be imposed on members of Congress who supported Trump's lies before Congress, who basically supported what happened last weekend?
Well, look, I think it was clear for a long time before January the 6th that there was no evidence of fraud that systematically tilted this election toward Biden. I'm not saying there was no fraud. I was born and raised in Baltimore. I know what big city Democratic machines do. They commit fraud routinely. They do it even when they don't need to. They do it to stay in practice, if nothing else. So I have no doubt fraudulent votes were cast in this election. But there was zero evidence, given uncounted opportunities, to show that the election was stolen. I think the real outcome was that the Democrats were better able to take advantage of the substantial increase in voting by mail and early voting. Republicans were not, although they were aware of all these changes before the election, and Trump didn't complain about them until after the election, which shows he was willing to run his chances that maybe Republicans could cope with it, and only complained when he knew he had lost. So, I think particularly with members of Congress, this is something they're going to have to deal with on their own. But I think some of the members of Congress who engaged in this have already been disowned by some of their reporters back in their home states. And they're all going to have to think about it. I would say I am generally against the criminalization of politics. I think the way you decide who's up and who's down is the people vote. Let's stop trying to find ways to have people other than the people who vote make the decisions. Vice President Pence staging a coup d'etat under the 25th Amendment, which is not a license to stage a coup, which is one reason why he's not going to do it. Let's have faith in elections. Fundamentally, if you don't have faith in elections, the system isn't going to work.
Okay, finally and briefly, to make your time here worthwhile, for a public service announcement, do you have another book coming?
No, but I do have an article. It's just been published in National Review on why, if Biden goes back into the Iran nuclear deal, as we discussed before, it should be submitted to the Senate as a treaty. I wrote that with Professor John Yoo, and I expect routinely to have a barrage of articles on the failings of the Biden administration and national security policy coming out. So anybody who's listening who would like to get on our distribution list, they can get in touch. We'd be happy to send them out as I write them.
Likewise. Well, look, I've got to really thank you, Ambassador Bolton. As always, this has been a frank and lively discussion. You've never hedged on issues, so it's always a pleasure to have you here and answer the questions. On behalf of the Foreign Press Association, I'd really like to thank you. And on to the members of the Foreign Press Association, I'm sorry if your questions weren't there. As you saw, there were a lot of questions coming in here. I'm trying to, with my limited multitasking capability, reconcile them and pull them together so that we could get Ambassador Bolton's sharp and acerbic answers on these things. So we welcome you to our next events. Please get in touch with us as well about our program, which is building up for the new year. And this will be interesting times for all of us, I think. Thank you, Ambassador Bolton.
Well, thanks again for having me. I enjoyed it, and good luck to all of you.
Thank you.